I've dedicated my life to photography in remote locations, as far back as I can recall. While most people have routine jobs, my work involves packing gear and vanishing into nowhere. That's simply what the job entails. I thrive on capturing shots that are impossible to fake. I've slept in canyons, on mountain ridges, and even once in a snow cave, digging myself out when a storm arrived faster than anticipated. I don't get easily frightened. In fact, solitude is something I deeply crave. Back in August 2021, I was working on a project in the Great Basin Desert. The area near Aleli, Nevada, is one of the most desolate stretches I've ever encountered. During the day, it features vast salt flats, jagged brush, and heat shimmer. At night, it feels like being placed on another planet. Cold, with endless stars so dense they seem capable of engulfing you. I had been driving on dirt tracks, hiking with my pack, scouting for locations. My plan was to set up near some striking rock formations, capture the golden hour and early morning light, and then move on. For 2 weeks, this was my rhythm. Lonely roads, solitary campsites, and I was perfectly content with it. I knew my routes well, carried maps, a backup GPS, and more water than I'd ever realistically need. On the 5th day, I discovered something out of place. There aren't many trees out there, especially tall ones. Mostly you find sagebrush, stunted junipers, and occasionally a twisted pine if you're at a high enough elevation. But I came across a lone tree, possibly an oak, standing separate from everything else. It had a wide trunk, with branches stretched as if it had clawed its way through years of storms just to survive. However, what truly caught my eye wasn't the tree itself. It was the chains. Rusted iron chains hung from the branches. They were thick, heavy, and looked industrial. Some were looped through higher limbs, dangling several feet down, their ends corroded. Others were wrapped tightly around the trunk, so long ago that the bark had grown over sections, effectively swallowing the metal. I put my pack down and walked circles around the tree, taking photos from every possible angle. The desert stretched empty for miles around. No ranch fences, no old mining equipment, nothing that would explain why someone hauled steel chains out there just to bind a tree. I figured it must have been ranching gear, maybe a long-forgotten corral marker, perhaps a tether point for something. Still, I couldn't shake a sense of wrongness about it. The desert is full of old relics, sure, but this felt deliberate, as if someone meant for it to be found. I told myself not to overthink it. In my line of work, I've seen stranger things. Abandoned sheds, graffiti in the middle of nowhere, even a row of broken TVs dumped in a canyon like some strange shrine. People leave their marks in the wild, but chains embedded in living bark. That one lingered in my mind. I camped nearby, perhaps 200 yards from the tree. My intention was to photograph it at sunrise, when the light would cross the basin and cast those chains in stark relief. I spent the evening cooking freeze-dried pasta on my small stove, drinking instant coffee and reviewing the day's photos. The desert was quiet, broken only by a lone coyote and the soft buzz of insects in the scrub. I remember leaning back, watching the sky. Nights like that were exactly why I do this work. I set my alarm for before dawn and crawled into my sleeping bag. I don't recall falling asleep, but I do remember waking up. At first the sound was faint, a metallic clink so soft I thought it was part of a dream. I shifted in the bag, listening intently. Another clink, then a faint scrape, followed by the sound of metal dragging against bark. I sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The night was perfectly still, no wind, stars blazing overhead. My gaze immediately went to the tree. The chains were swaying, not wildly, but just enough to catch the starlight. I froze, watching. My first thought was coyotes. Maybe they brushed against the chains as they passed, but the sound wasn't coming from ground level. It seemed higher up, as if lynx were rubbing against a branch overhead. I listened for paw steps, for breathing, for anything. There was nothing, just the slow creak of chain shifting against bark, as if someone had tugged it and then released it. I zipped the tent back up, sitting there with my flashlight in one hand and my camera in the other. Minutes felt like they stretched on. Eventually the noise stopped. I told myself I must have imagined it. Or perhaps the temperature change was causing the metal links to contract slightly. Science always offers an explanation. The next day, I captured the shots I had come for. Wide shots of the tree against the basin horizon, and close-ups of the bark enveloping the rust. I tried not to dwell on the noise from the previous night, but the memory lingered in the back of my mind. By evening, I debated moving my camp. Part of me reasoned, "You got the photos, now leave it." But another part wanted to convince myself it was nothing, just physics, just my imagination. So I stayed put. I followed the same routine. Cooked, had coffee, checked my gear. This time, before going to sleep, I left my phone's recorder app running. At 1:30 a.m., I woke again. The sound was back. Clink, scrape. A faint rattle like links brushing against wood. I grabbed my phone and checked the recording. The app picked up static distortion, as if there was interference, but no clear sound. The chain swayed again. This time I fully unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight. The beam illuminated the rusted metal. The chains were swinging slightly, but there wasn't a breath of wind. Nothing touched my face. Then I heard it clearly, loud enough to dispel any doubt. A chain was pulled taut, as if someone had yanked it hard and was holding it. The sound reverberated through the area. My flashlight beam shook, but I saw nothing. No figure, no animal, just the swaying links. I ducked back inside, zipped the tent closed, and sat clutching the knife from my cook kit until dawn. I left before the sun even began to rise. I packed my gear quickly, shoved my camera into the bag, and felt an overwhelming urge to get out of there. I looked back once before driving off. The tree stood just as it had before. Chains rusted, bark scarred, silent in the daylight. I almost convinced myself it was nothing more than a trick of the night. But weeks later, when I developed the film, I saw something I couldn't explain. One frame showed the chains stretched tight, angled outward as if being pulled by invisible hands. My memory was clear. I had never seen them like that, not once. But the negative didn't lie. I showed the photograph to another photographer. He laughed and asked, "Looks staged. Did you set it up to scare clients?" I didn't bother arguing. Any explanation would only make me sound crazy. But I know what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see. Chains that moved without any wind. A pull that echoed in the night. A photograph that captured something my own eyes couldn't. In the silence of the desert, you learn that the land doesn't belong to you, and sometimes what's left behind still has a grip on the living. Story 2. You drive long enough and you learn to recognize the signs. What's part of the road and what definitely isn't supposed to be there. It'll get dusk. A car struggling on a spare tire. Fog rolling low across valleys. That's all normal. But the fog that settled over Lolo Pass that night was different. It wasn't just thick. It swallowed light. I was heading west with a light load. Nothing urgent. Weather reports had mentioned patchy fog, which usually just means maintaining distance and keeping your wits about you. But by the time the highway curved into the forest, the mist wasn't patchy. It formed a wall, heavy and motionless. My headlights became ineffective, illuminating only a flat, glowing sheet right in front of my hood. I slowed down, keeping a firm grip on the wheel. This was the kind of fog where mistakes have consequences. Too close to the shoulder, too sudden braking, and the night offers no forgiveness. I remembered a turnout I'd used before, wide enough to park without blocking traffic. I tried to locate it and let the tires crunch onto the gravel, stopping until the truck was squared away. I turned off the headlights, cracked the window, and let the silence seep in. Out of habit, I keyed the mic. Dispatch 607. Pulling off near mile marker 170. Fog's too thick. Static was the only answer, which wasn't surprising. These mountain passes swallow radio and cell signals effortlessly. I poured coffee from my thermos, listened to the metal ticking of cooling brakes, and told myself I'd wait for the fog to lift. It was just another night. Then I saw a flashlight beam cutting through the fog. At first I assumed it was a stranded motorist. The beam moved slowly, left to right, as if someone were searching. I waited for a voice, but none came. Just the steady, drifting light. I rationalized it with a reasonable explanation. Maybe a hiker who'd stayed out too late. Perhaps someone who'd slipped down an unused side road. I grabbed my own flashlight, stepped out, and took a few cautious steps. The fog obscured everything beyond 10 feet. The other light froze, holding its position. I called out, "You okay?" My voice sounded thin and distorted by the mist. No answer. I tried again. "I have a radio. Need help?" The beam dipped, then rose. It wasn't a signal I could interpret. As I stood there trying to figure it out, 2 more lights flickered on. One to my left, further back. One to my right, closer. None of them moved. None of them spoke. Every instinct inside me went on high alert. Stranded people usually yell or wave. They don't appear silently, positioning themselves around you like prey. I backed up slowly, 1 step at a time until my boots hit the gravel. Then I slid back into the cab, locked the doors, and turned off the interior light. I maintained a calm exterior, but inside, I felt like I couldn't catch a full breath. Through the windshield, the beams began to advance, moving slowly enough to be walking. Yet I heard nothing. No crunch of gravel, no rustling brush, no voices, just the growing brightness of 3 lights closing in. I grabbed the air horn cord and pulled it. The blast ripped through the fog like a cannon shot. The lights cut out instantly. Gone. The blackness that replaced them felt denser than before. I waited, hand clenched on the cord. Nothing happened. I pulled the horn again. Still nothing. That's when I heard a faint metallic clink from the right side of the truck, like 2 pieces of steel touching. Just once, sharp enough to make my skin tingle. That was enough. I started the engine, let it roar back to life, eased the truck forward until the trailer cleared the turnout, then pulled back onto the road, driving slow and steady, as if navigating snow where mistakes are punished severely. The fog pressed in, but 10 minutes later, it thinned enough for me to see 20 yards ahead instead of just 6. The relief was immediate. I didn't even notice my shoulders relaxing until they did. By dawn, I was at a cafe down the road and called the highway patrol. The trooper didn't laugh or dismiss it as imagination. He mentioned they'd received other calls about phantom lights on that very stretch, sometimes attributed to hikers, sometimes to optical illusions in the fog, but usually nothing was left behind. That's what bothered me most. If it was people, they left no trace. If it was something else, I had no category for it. Either way, the precise arrangement, the way those beams appeared in a triangle, defied anything I'd seen in all my years of driving. I keep reminding myself of a simple truth. Caution, not beer, guided me that night. I stayed inside the cab, protected by steel and glass from the fog. And perhaps that's why I'm here telling you this now, instead of someone reading about a driver who vanished on Lolo Pass. Story 3. For a while now, I've been living the van life dream, traveling across the country, taking remote jobs, chasing freedom, and seeking views that can't be contained within 4 walls. By May 2020, I was deep in Idaho, parked alongside the Sawtooth Wilderness. I'd done this countless times before, pulling off into forest clearings, cooking simple meals on a small propane burner, sleeping with the windows slightly open to the scent of pine and the chirping of crickets. I wasn't new to solitude and wasn't afraid of it. In fact, I enjoyed it. But this particular stretch of wilderness gave me one of the few moments where that enjoyment shifted, where solitude felt more like being exposed. I'd parked my van near a trailhead, the kind of spot where maybe 1 or 2 cars pass through in a day. Sunset had painted the mountains orange, and I remember thinking, this is exactly why I live this way. I ate, read for a bit, and eventually crawled into bed. When darkness fully settled, I noticed it. A flicker in the distance through the trees. It was warm and orange, a campfire. It was odd because the fire was far off, at least a mile into the clearing, nowhere near the road. Most campers I've met out here set up camp within easy walking distance of their cars. I figured someone just wanted privacy. I continued watching it through my slightly open window. The flames were small but constant. No voices carried through the air. No shadows moved across the fire. After a while, I convinced myself it wasn't strange and rolled over, falling asleep. By the second evening, I'd almost forgotten about it. But when darkness fell, it was there again, in the exact same place, burning just as steadily. I knew I probably shouldn't, but I felt compelled to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward it. The air was damp, that kind of chill that seems to cling to you. When I reached the meadow, the fire was little more than glowing embers. A single folding chair sat beside a log. The ground around it was bare dirt, with no gear or tent in sight. I touched the chair. It was still warm. Whoever had been there hadn't left long ago. But I stood there alone, my beam sweeping across empty grass. I didn't linger. I just turned and walked back quickly, that unsettling feeling chasing me the whole way. I debated moving camp entirely, but either laziness or stubbornness kept me put. I told myself the fire belonged to a hiker, maybe even a park ranger. Still, I locked my van that night with more care than usual. Sometime after midnight, I woke to silence, not the usual quiet of the woods. This was a heavy stillness. I looked toward the meadow. Sure enough, the fire was burning again. I was about to roll over when I noticed something worse. My passenger door wasn't fully shut, just slightly ajar. A thin seam of light from the interior dome barely visible. I knew I'd locked it. I always lock it. I grabbed the wrench I kept under my mattress and checked every corner of the van. Nothing was missing, but the glove box was open with papers scattered inside. I slammed it shut, hit the locks, and sat in the driver's seat until dawn, wrench in hand. At one point, I'm certain I heard low breathing, as if someone were standing just outside the thin metal walls. But every time I looked out, the trees stood empty. At first light, I drove off. I didn't even stop for coffee. I just turned the key and didn't look back at the meadow. I didn't camp alone for a while after that. I stayed in RV parks surrounded by families, people who waved hello in the morning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly. Maybe the fire was just a coincidence. But it didn't feel like a coincidence. When I finally worked up the courage to review the dashcam footage, something I'd installed purely for insurance, I found something that made my stomach turn. Watching the playback, before I even turned off the engine according to the timestamp, the fire was already burning in the distance. I hadn't noticed it at the time. I sat frozen at my laptop, watching frame by frame. The fire glowed, and at the edge of the frame, just outside the fire's glow, was a silhouette. Tall, slender. The silhouette of what looked like an old man bent slightly forward. I hadn't seen him that night, not once. I closed my laptop, shaking, knowing I'd never return to that stretch of the sawtooths. Now, if I ever spot a lone fire burning night after night in the same spot, I'll keep driving because I still don't know if that campfire was meant to lure me in or to remind me that I was already being watched. Story 4. I've always been the kind of person who finds reasons to wander where I probably shouldn't. Not for criminal reasons, just out of curiosity. I hike. I film with my drone. I explore the overlooked corners of maps that others ignore. That May of 2021, I was in Nevada, outside Tonopah, with plenty of time on my hands and freshly charged drone batteries. The desert out there holds a different kind of quiet. The only sounds are the wind scraping rock and the crunch of your own boots on sand. I liked it for the stillness. It makes anything unusual stand out. That's how I found the fence. It wasn't a typical ranch fence. It wasn't a barbed wire line meant to contain cattle. It looked ancient, patched together with rusted posts, barbed wire loops, and rows of "keep out" signs that didn't match. Some were printed metal, faded by the sun. Others were hand-painted on scraps of plywood. A couple were so weathered, the text was illegible. And then there were the objects tied to the wire. At first glance, I thought they were wind chimes or scraps of fabric, perhaps left by bored hikers. But upon closer inspection, they weren't random. Bones wired into crosses, feathers bound with twine, and pieces of tin cut into crude shapes. Some dangled in the wind. Others were jammed tightly into the wire, as if meant to remain there indefinitely. I'll admit, I thought the drone footage would be perfect. I unpacked my DJI, ran the pre-flight, and sent it into the air. The screen lit up with a bird's-eye view of the endless desert, but the fence cut across it like a scar. Beyond the fence, the landscape wasn't just empty brush. There were odd shapes, patches of dirt that didn't match the surrounding terrain. I lowered the drone, steadied the camera, and realized they were dugouts. Mounds of earth suggesting someone had excavated pits and tried to camouflage them. Initially, I figured they were just collapsed mines. Nevada is full of those, but then I angled the drone closer to one of the pits. That's when I noticed movement. Someone rose out of the dirt. A man coated in sand, as if he'd been buried there, pulled himself upright. He was still when I first saw him, just standing there. Then another figure climbed out of a different pit, 20 yards away. And another. They weren't doing anything, just standing, looking directly at the drone. That was the first time I felt a genuine sense of dread. I was out there completely alone. I swiveled the drone wide, gaining altitude to get a broader view. The screen showed half a dozen, perhaps more, figures scattered across the fenced-off area. None of them moved except to slightly tilt their heads, as if tracking the drone. Then the feed cut to black. No static, no warning about a weak signal, just dead air. I yanked the controller close, clutching it as if that would help. The drone wasn't cheap, and I didn't want to leave it behind. I stuffed my gear into my pack and jogged down the wash where I thought it had landed. That's when I saw something tied to the fence that hadn't been there before. A new totem. It was a stick figure, literally a stick lashed into a human shape, wired securely to the barbs. It was fresh. The twine was clean, and it swayed slightly as if recently placed. I stopped. In that moment I knew, without concrete proof, that someone else was out there with me. I didn't retrieve the drone. I didn't even look for it. I turned and hiked fast back to my car, driving straight to Tonopah. On the drive out, I kept expecting headlights to appear in my rearview mirror. Some beat-up Mad Max-style pickup truck pulling onto the dirt road behind me. But the road remained empty. At the sheriff's office, I tried to explain. The man at the desk listened as if he'd heard this before. "Desert squatters," he said, flipping a form. "You probably spooked a camp." But the truth is, there was no camp, no tents, no supplies, no vehicles, just pits in the dirt, and people seemingly emerging from them. He didn't write that down, just logged it as trespassers beyond marked property. That night, I crashed in a motel. I felt foolish about how badly my hands were shaking when I brushed my teeth. It wasn't just fear. It was the thought that whoever tied that totem had been close enough to watch me without making a sound. When I hit the highway again, I told myself I was fine. Just squatters, like the sheriff said. People hiding out where nobody would bother them. But the truth is that explanation never felt right. Squatters don't stand motionless under camouflage nets staring at the sky. They don't attach fresh totems to fences right after you leave. I still hike, still fly the drone, but never anywhere near Tonopah. And if I see a fence strung with warnings or what look like talismans, I don't go near it. I don't stop. I don't even slow down. Because that day taught me something I can't unlearn. Some fences aren't meant to keep us out. They're warnings, plain and simple. Warnings that whatever's on the other side is better left undisturbed. And I listened. I was 26, 3 months into a solo bike ride across the country, from Oregon to Virginia. That was the plan. I'd already battled headwinds in Kansas, slept behind countless churches, and learned the hard way which gas stations welcome sweaty cyclists and which don't. By the time I reached Kentucky that September, I figured I'd seen about everything the road could throw at me. Turns out I hadn't even come close. It was late afternoon, that kind of early fall day where the sun still feels like summer. But the chill in your lungs tells the truth. I was tired and hungry, so when I spotted a patch of shade near a rusted guardrail, I pulled off. I unclipped my shoes, leaned the bike against the metal, and grabbed a handful of trail mix while consulting my map. That's when I heard gravel crunching behind me. I turned, expecting a car, or maybe a farmer pulling into a hidden driveway. Instead, I saw a man walking alone in the ditch, as if he'd stepped straight out of the woods. He wore work pants stained at the knees, an old cap pulled low, and in one hand he carried a grocery sack that crinkled with each step. In the other, a hatchet. He wasn't swinging it or holding it threateningly, just carrying it as casually as someone might carry a hammer returning from the shed. I told myself to stay calm, but my voice still came out too quickly. "Hey, how's it going?" Nothing. He just kept walking, chewing something from the bag. I realized it was jerky from the smell that drifted over. Smoky, peppered. His gaze shifted from my bike to the water bottle strapped to the frame, then back to the road. Not once did he answer. I tried again. Need directions? My voice was forced, overly polite, Midwestern nice. He chewed and kept walking. The road curved ahead, blind in both directions. No houses nearby. My phone showed no signal. It was just me, him, and the silence. I decided to pedal on. I clipped in, pushed the pedals, kept a steady pace. Not a sprint, not yet. He matched my rhythm for a dozen paces, then let me pull ahead. He just stood there in the grass, chewing jerky, watching. I didn't look back again until I was a mile down the road. That night, I pulled into a county park. A pavilion, a bathroom smelling of damp brick. No cars around. I set up my tent under the roof, tying a fishing line to the zipper so I'd wake if anyone touched it. Pepper spray by my pillow, shoes and helmet within easy reach in case of panic. I ate the rest of my trail mix and read a worn paperback until it got dark. The quiet felt heavy. At some point in the night, I woke up, not because of a sound specifically, but because the air felt different, as if someone new had entered the space. I held my breath and listened. For a moment, there was only the creaking of the pavilion structure. Then, faint sounds of cloth brushing against wood. Then silence again. I counted backward from 100 until I drifted off. Not really asleep, more like dozing. At dawn, I crawled out of the tent. My bike was there. My shoes were where I'd left them. But something felt wrong. My tent pegs were slightly shifted, as if someone had pressed a hand against the side. My food bag was unrolled and folded back neatly. And the pepper spray, the one thing I'd kept within reach, was gone. I searched everywhere, under the sleeping pad, in my jersey pockets, even under the picnic table. Nothing. My stomach sank. Whoever had come through hadn't taken food or gear, just the spray, like leaving a message. I packed quickly and got back on the road. The next town had a Dollar General. I bought the only spray they had, meant for dog walkers, and a bottle of water I barely tasted. My hands shook at the counter. The cashier didn't ask why, and I didn't volunteer the reason. For days after, I couldn't relax. Every time a truck slowed near me, my hands tightened on the handlebars. Twice, pickups pulled off into driveways, and the drivers gave the usual country wave. But it felt wrong. I camped only at churches or cheap motels where I could lock the door. One motel clerk suggested I bring my bike inside so it wouldn't get stolen. I almost laughed. Someone stealing my bike felt less frightening than someone quietly taking the one thing meant to protect me. 5 nights later, I camped behind a volunteer fire station. The chief, a kind man named Toby, told me, "We sleep lightly. You holler if you need us." I nodded, grateful. I still barely slept. At 3 a.m., when a truck idled at the stop sign out front, I lay there holding my new spray, listening for doors opening. They never did. The truck moved on. But I didn't unclench until dawn. I never saw the man again. Didn't hear him. Didn't see him. He was just gone. But the weight of what he did lingered heavier than if he'd swung that hatchet at me. He'd come into my camp, rearranged things while I slept, and taken one small thing. Not to rob me, not to hurt me, just to remind me that he could. When I finished the ride and told friends about the highlights, the skies in Kansas, the kindness of strangers, the beauty of Virginia's Blue Ridge, I kept that story buried. Because how do you explain that the scariest part wasn't the hatchet or the man, or even his silence? It was the promise in that missing can of spray, the knowledge that someone had chosen to intrude into my space and leave me with a void that felt heavier than the object itself. And every time I camp alone now, I still check my tent zipper twice. I still set a whistle by my pillow. I still think about the man in Kentucky who never spoke a word. Because silence, I've learned, can communicate more than any words ever could. If these stories kept you on edge, remember that people vanish in the middle of nowhere every year. And not all of those vanishings are accidents. Please hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss another scare, and tell us in the comments which moment made you say, "Nope." And if you've ever called night driving calming, yeah, you'll probably rethink that after the next video. Click now to watch 4 disturbing night drive horror stories. Because silence on the road doesn't mean you're alone. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.